Movies, films, cinema. Whatever you like to call them, it's all about experiences. Moments from different cultures from various parts of the world that we live in. And the life of those people who reside there. An outlook to a different way of living, which almost might seem foreign to us. An alienating phenomena, which can excite, shock, or bewilder us. The mundane for them can be overwhelming to an outsider. It's a wonderful medium that gives us the opportunity to peek inside that dimensional window, which has the power to take us into an entirely different situation than the one we choose to live in. And if it's carried out in an efficient manner, we get to witness a powerful piece of media that can potentially ignite immensely strong emotion inside us, a life-changing experience to some. For some people, certain entertainment media speak in volumes that any human being can't compete with. It transcends every boundary that language and different culture brings with it. Almost everyone finds a safe place in certain mediums. To some, it's music, and to others, it's video games. To them, it becomes more than just an entertaining outlet, providing way more valuable experience than that. You can call it whatever you want, a source of entertainment or a piece of art. In the end of the day, it represents a certain culture, becoming the spokesperson for that group of people. The easily digestible nature of films makes it the source which defines that culture. It's how most people get introduced to something foreign to them and become accustomed to their way of living. There are various film industries around the world, each providing with a different sort of exposure to the viewer. They aren't entirely different, but there are subtle differences to them, which is a given. People with different upbringing and surrounding will deliver with end products that are distinct from each other and attract disparate sort of people. As it's spoiled from the title, I'm gonna focus on the Asian side of that industry and what it has to serve for me to feast on and quench my inner thirst of watching that moving picture's goodness. And all of that isn't because I'm from Asia. My ethnicity doesn't play any role as to why I like it. Not even a minor one. The answer in short is they are better than their Western counterparts. And the longer explanation is this video. And the numerous reasons I will mention later in this, however long this thing will go on for. So, without wasting too much time, let's get back onto the topic in hand. It's not like films from other sectors of the world are inherently bad or can't compete with the one in question. Hollywood still holds a major place in my lists of film that I really admire. They rank amongst titles from all over the world. But no matter what genre it tends to be, Asian films always persevere its way to the top, as most of my top 10s are dominated by films from that part of the world. Not because it delivers a homely experience. At some moments, it is somewhat relatable. But that doesn't alter how I perceive those particular films. It hardly has any effect on me. I don't have a bias towards Asian media by ranking them above others. I hardly consume anything from there other than their films, and even that is quite rare. I tend to gravitate towards works which have some sort of value other than just entertaining the person consuming it. And most of the times, Asian films manage that with an impressive ease, while its competition struggle by overdoing and oversaturating their work. Rather than focusing on what it provides to the viewer, it overthinks about how it looks and presents itself to the public. It tries to be too fancy and flashy, rather than being organic and original. The source of their project or the material they use aren't the problem. It's how they use and utilize it. Rather than letting it come naturally, everything it stands for comes off as being forced, and a product of being altered by so many people that it starts to feel devoid of any personality. It's not hollow per se, but overbloated with so many ideas, concepts, and elements, and the way they are implemented makes it similar to an unappetizing fast food that they are obsessed with. Which is why majority of the American remakes tends to fall apart so easily. They have a tough time capturing the feeling or emotion of the surrounding that the original title did so effortlessly, which makes their output feel so shallow and underwhelming when compared to the one they copied off. A bigger budget and world-renowned actors can never work as a substitute for that. And genres where this is extremely prominent are horror and thriller/mystery. It's not just limited to Asian films though. Hollywood loves to copy works from various other countries and turn them into blockbuster garbage with a bland and limiting imitation which nobody asked for. But they continue to do so because there are people who, for some reason, prefer to watch that. As again, it's spoiled from the title, thriller/mystery genre is of particular interest in this video. Even though Asian horror will always have a special place in my heart for traumatizing my younger self, and in general, the horror genre is very near and dear to me. No matter how much of a scaredy cat I was, and still am, I will always express my love for that wonderful set of films. Thriller/mystery genre sadly takes the second place. And if it is really irking you as to why I'm mentioning those two genres together, allow me to explain why they are kind of similar. At their base, there are differences between them, and they aren't particularly similar. With that being said, most films that come under those genres tend to overlap each other, jumping between those two categories of films, borrowing certain aspects from it and implementing it in their own fashion, which, if done correctly, complements their final product, as they tend to gel well together and are interchangeable for most parts, which is why most people are confused as to what genre in particular these type of films come under. Gone are the days when it was just a murder mystery or exhilarating thrillers, and it's for the better, as films which doesn't let it confine itself under the threshold of a singular genre are usually the ones who stand the wrath of time, becoming a timeless classic of some sort, being way ahead of its time in terms of how it was enacted, which doesn't give off an old-timey feeling, freeing itself from the constraints of their timeline. As the thriller genre in itself isn't entirely realistic, you do have to turn off some logical thinking in your mind to fully enjoy it, just so the story can have room to breathe and progress. Still, it's far better than romantic or comedy type of films, who are in an entirely different league of being overly obnoxious and comical in a bad way for no apparent reason. While thriller or mystery genre are a near perfect mix of fantasy and reality, sitting in a sweet spot where they meet, which suffices and fulfills my adult brain and the way it thinks. As time goes by and I get older, it becomes more and more difficult to get excited for films with sci-fi or fantasy elements. I miss that childlike amazement I used to have when I was young. It's nearly impossible to achieve that same feeling nowadays. Maybe there's an issue with current films who can't capture that same emotion. Or maybe my mind is too fault with all those adult remarks that it makes. The potency it used to have on me has diminished over the years and taken over by thriller and mystery-based films. Horror has always been a constant throughout my life. That will never change. But as I said earlier, all of those titles aren't totally accurate or lifelike, which is why whenever I come across a film that uses certain tools to make it feel more realistic, I get hooked by it in an instant. From being based on a true event to keeping the subject matter grounded to reality, these certain criteria help it to elevate that experience, feeling, and emotion I keep talking about. And to no one's surprise, Asian thriller films comfortably encapsulate those aforementioned facets. Of course it does. Otherwise, I wouldn't have made this video praising them. The atmosphere that I crave from such films is provided on an exquisite platter for me to devour, which other titles fail to capture or are inept at successfully portraying that. The way certain directors decide to tackle their genre and what it stands for is particularly interesting, as majority of those films deal with heavy and touchy topics, which most people wouldn't be comfortable to watch in a big screen, as they boast certain scenes which aren't easy to digest or sits well with the viewer. They aren't shy while using shots that are incredibly dark and grim in nature, from topics that they delve into to the sort of characters they use in their tales. But the way they go about it is weirdly wholesome and heartfelt, celebrating their and humanity's imperfections, which is vastly different than the one we get from Western media, who go to an unimaginable extent to play it safe and keep the overall mood on the lighter side of things, to chase that unachievable goal of appealing to everyone, making the commercial success their priority, rather than giving the work in question justice or treat it in any other way than just another endeavor to make more money, which is extremely rare in Asian films, especially in the thriller and horror genre, as they aren't afraid to take chances, break boundaries, and overcome obstacles to provide something truly unique. Those films don't come off as being tryhards to appeal to a larger audience. They don't undermine their end product for the sake of increasing their profit margin. Their films, for all intent and purposes, are very human-like and true to real life in nature. They feel like they are made by, for, and are about your common person that we see on day-to-day basis. You don't need to look far to witness something truly bizarre in the world we live in. It might seem normal to us, but we as a species lead a very dark and gloomy life. There isn't anything holy or pure about us. All of us have issues that we suffer from on the daily basis. But those exact quirks is what makes us so unique and stand apart from each other. And these films perfectly get hold of that essence and manage to express that in a manner that feels genuine and not overly pretentious by any means. Their unadulterated identity of life is unmatchable. To solidify my points, I'm going to use 3 films as examples to represent how Asian films have perfected the thriller genre as a whole, from how it has mastered the core aspects of it to the way it takes the ordinary and converts it into an extraordinary spectacle. No matter what sort of film it is or what genre it comes under, one of the most vital aspects it has to nail down, well, at least for me, for it to be placed in a high pedestal, is having a strong start. That can mean many things to different people. It can be about pace, and if it's a slow burner, or a snapping fast and quick-paced flow narrative. But I'm not talking about that. I don't mind stories which are being told in a slower fashion. Some of my favorite in this and other genres, which are usually fast-moving in nature, have a measured approach to the way it reveals its plot. It isn't about that. Just because some films have a slower start doesn't mean they aren't good or can stand toe-to-toe with your blood-pumping, adrenaline-rushing, or body heat-enhancing titles. It's not about the pacing of the film at all. It's about how it sets the necessary pieces that are needed for it to become a well-oiled and functioning story to get that desired effects on the person watching. For me, a good or strong start means setting the mood, showcasing that atmosphere, slapping me with that vibe as fast as it is possible. Just submerge me under that lush, rich, and flavorful environment. If a film manages to do that, I don't care if it has a runtime of 200 minutes or has a really sluggish start that hampers the storyline, I will at least have something of value to take away from that whole experience. Well, there are moments when the wait for it to finish isn't worth it, and it's simply better to utilize that time by staring at your ceiling, pondering about some dumb stuff. And to expand more on this topic, the title I have chosen here is Memories of Murder, a South Korean crime thriller film released in 2003, directed by Bong Joon-ho. Yes, that director whose only film majority of the people have seen is Parasite, which took the world by surprise and won the Best Picture in 2020, which it totally deserved by every means. It can be a perfect example for many of my points that I mentioned or discussed earlier. It's an undeniable masterpiece that does a wonderful job at exhibiting the abnormality in things we see as normal. Still, out of all the titles from his filmography, which spans for almost 2 decades, Memories of Murder takes the crown for being something truly special and has a simple yet spellbinding charm to it. In this story that is loosely based on true events about a serial killer that terrorized a small province in South Korea from 1986 to 1991, which was the first confirmed and documented serial killer in that whole country. We follow Detective Park and Cho, 2 easygoing individuals who are assigned to investigate a double murder case which took place in their small village, assisted by their basic skills and knowledge about the subject matter. It doesn't take a lot of time to realize that the people who are in charge of solving the case are hilariously inept at their job. They work for an undermanned, underfunded, and unprepared department. So, to no one's surprise, they struggle to find or identify the perpetrator who is behind all the assaults and murder of young women in that area, as their methods weren't of any practical use. Hence, the superiors look for assistance from an outsider who has more experience and is adequate enough for the task in hand, which brings in Detective Seo from Seoul, as the trio tries their best to solve this mammoth of a case, which leads to this incredible yet tragic journey of 3 individuals who try their utmost best to do something for the better, but fail to do so for reasons that aren't in their control. Their technical and ethical capabilities can be questioned, but the sheer determination to help the ones in need can't by any means. They were simply failed by a system that hardly works. Without going much into the plot of this film, as I don't want to spoil this truly iconic crime drama for anyone who hasn't seen it, easily one of the best, if not the best, serial killer films of all time. There are various aspects about it that makes it a contender for that title. From how sharp it is with its social and political commentary, which reveals the underlying societal issues, to the way it uses the familiar concepts of murder mystery or serial killer thrillers with a minimal change that does wonders. My exact reason as to why I picked this title to be used here. So, what is this subtle change I am talking about? Well, what separates this particular film from the others of its time are mainly 2 things: the rural setting and the usage of its characters. When I was talking about atmosphere, I was talking about how it takes place in a somewhat stranded sort of region. You know, the small city vibe, where everyone knows about everybody, from their names, locations, and whereabouts, to what they do and how they are as a person, reminiscent of the American suburban and the false, safe, and innocent feeling that it gives off. Only minor difference being that those suburban areas are known to have less criminal activities, while in here, it's rampant, but gets silenced or is just a commonplace that no one minds. It's not like they aren't aware of it or know it's an awful sight, but they turn a blind eye because they know it can't be changed by them or can ask help from the authorities. Which is why, when a series of brutal murders takes place in their small, secluded village, they are, unfortunately, unable to do anything concrete about the whole situation. Not because they weren't prepared for it. Nobody's prepared for something like that. It's not a naturally occurring disaster that can be known about in advance to be dealt with. To simply say it, they didn't care about it. When it comes to villages or rural regions, they are the first one who get ignored when it comes to, well, anything. This exact factor gives the whole film, sadly, a lifelike feel, which, when mixed with it being based on a true event, makes the whole scenario a dreadful situation to be in. And all of that isn't helped by how incompetent the police department was in that place, who somehow solves the case, and how it goes along with the former one. The two key characters were, without any sugarcoating, extremely stupid at their job, and by all means were punching above their weight, which wasn't helped by the system they were working for, that hardly helped them to ease the whole process, and just added more hurdles for their nimble and overburdened legs to overcome, which is another difference it has from their Western counterparts, where we either get a couple of vibrant characters with enchanting chemistry, or someone who is an all-knowing and insanely cunning person who somehow solves the case. Something that I'm not a huge fan of, for various reasons. The major one being, it isn't realistic at all. We hardly get detectives of that manner in real life. Like, ever. While the characters in here are an honest portrayal of how those people really are and how it all works. You can't just take away that inevitable human error and the curiosity to overdo. And it doesn't. There are so many issues with the way they go about doing their job, which doesn't make sense or is plain wrong. Their animated nature and them being extremely flawed makes them ideal for this. It's an accurate representation of how a person like that will act and behave in that tense and dire situation. They don't know or understand how to handle it, so they just go with their instincts and gut feeling. And can you even blame them for it? They work in a position they weren't qualified for, in an organization that couldn't care less about them or the people residing in such areas. It's not about the characters per se, it's about the world they take place in, and being invested in the setting that they are set in, worrying about how the people who are in the backdrop will ever cope with it. This film, unknowingly, added so many rich layers to this overdone subgenre, themes that modern titles have a tough time to imitate or come near to the excellence of this low-budget masterpiece. They try to go for the same feeling that 100 titles before them have already provided, to give what has already been given. A long-gone formula that doesn't translate well now. It isn't limited to Hollywood. Almost every sector of this industry suffers from it. Still, that doesn't mean it can't be done anymore. The next film that I will use is the perfect antidote to that. So what does a film needs after it has set up a good base that lets the whole story play out without any obstruction? Well, that heavily depends on what genre it is. And for something like thriller, mystery, or horror if I may, one of the most vital facets it can or should have is a wide array of strings overarching to the main plot, being bountiful in terms of having layers to the whole story. Having just a singular narrative isn't going to cut it nowadays. As I mentioned earlier, it is a done and dusted method and isn't going to keep the audiences on their toes, which is the last thing you want in your thriller or mystery films, to give the audience more than needed comfort to correctly predict what is going to take place in the said film. You have to present the story in a manner that the viewer is always guessing what will happen next, concocting their personal theories as to what is actually happening in front of them. That doesn't mean you can just throw whatever in their face and hope at least some of it sticks, or bring in nonsensical plot lines to complicate for the sake of just adding complications. This is not me encouraging anyone to go overboard with their perfectly fine storyline, as it can easily ruin a good film in seconds. The lapse in judgments to add more layers can have damaging effects. Some titles work better with having a minimalistic approach to their plot, and that's what makes them special in their own way. Doing more with limitation is incredibly admirable. With that being said, Asian thrillers have almost mastered of having dozens of layers without oversaturating itself, and that is especially prominent in the title I have chosen for this point. The Wailing, a South Korean horror film which came out in 2016, directed by Na Hong-jin. Yes, I know it says horror, and I am talking about thriller and mystery titles here. But it isn't just a horror film. Different sources label it as being under various distinct genres, and there are valid reasons as to why is it so, as in its base it is more than another horror film. Of course it is that, and a really great one at that too. Back around half a year ago, in the spooky month, I streamed talking about my favorite horror films, and Wailing topped it. When I shared that list to my friend, he told me that he would have a tough time ranking all the films, but was absolutely sure which would be in the first position, and both of us said Wailing at the same time. It is a horror film to end all horror films. The best way I can put it is that this is the title you see after you have seen all the greats and classics, as nothing can top this. This is your horror retiring film. I know, these are some insane praises, but I can assure you that it does a wonderful job at living up to those remarks. It isn't one of those hyped up titles that fails miserably. That's the caliber of quality this film has, and precisely why I have chosen this title to be featured in here. It can easily satisfy almost every type of horror fanatic without feeling like it's too much to take in, and at the same time suffice the needs of being a mystery or thriller film. It's the prime example of a title that has numerous layers who work in perfect tandem with each other, complementing themselves in every single step they are asked to take. It's one of those films that you want to be continued long after it has exhausted its runtime. So let's discuss about what it does in that time period. In another small village, this time in a mountain region, again in South Korea, things start to go awry after a mysterious Japanese man joins their locality. The potential reasoning behind the infection that has made the villagers deranged as they start to violently attack and kill their family members for no logical reasoning behind their motives. And the arrival of the stranger seems to be the issue, or at least that's what most of the locals think, which leads to an investigation led by Jong-gu, who has to figure out these bizarre murders. Is it an evil spirit that is behind all of it, as proclaimed by his partner, or something that is grounded to reality? Well, whatever it can be, Jong-gu has a really tough time making sense of it. You might be noticing a pattern here, as this is another addition to that incompetent authority figure that I seem to enjoy. But this film is vastly different than the last one I mentioned. The major reason being that this whole story is set in a horror setting, which basically means that there are certain supernatural phenomena going on behind the scenes which is controlling everything, which is established or in the least can be figured out pretty easily in a single watch. There is nothing mind-boggling about this title, even though it might seem like that in the beginning, as there is a lot to take in. in a brief period of time, even if the runtime is almost 200 minutes, which it doesn't waste by introducing pointless threads to overwhelm the plot. It cleverly uses almost every known trope in the horror genre without overstaying its welcome. Where other films struggle at being lots of things at once and failing to be anything in particular, this doesn't. The style in which it unveils the incident that our vibrant policeman has to face is just simply amazing. Being dropped into this mystery that has taken this village by a storm. It captures the very human emotion that is almost impossible to be taken away from an individual. Evil. And the length one is willing to go for themselves and their family's survival. It's in our nature to do every imaginable and horrendous act just so it can guarantee that we will be the living one on the other end. It's an unnerving sight that you can't look away from. Na Hong-jin created a film that transcends numerous genres, picking elements from various tropes and embedded them into this contemporary masterpiece and a classic for the coming generation. Another reason as to why I picked this film amongst the sea of older titles, to prove all those people wrong who say that newer titles are objectively worse than the works from the past. Wailing is the living proof that there is a lot of mileage left in the hideous and terrifying tank of the horror mobile, with a sprinkle of thriller and mystery on the top to add more flavor. Na Hong-jin's older projects did help him to hone his skill. The Chaser in particular could have featured in this video as the cornerstone without much questions being asked. But the masterclass that the Wailing is helps it to sweep that sweet spot. But that sure did help the director to understand these lookalike genres so well and blend them together. Of course, that isn't a criteria I ask from every film that I watch. Titles like The Guilty are highly respected by me and many others. The unexpected nature of it comes from the lack of its variety, which might turn off a lot of people, as there isn't a lot going on in the screen. But the finale is so much more than anyone might have anticipated or have seen it coming. It makes the film a must-watch. With that being said, that is exactly what makes films like The Wailing such a privilege to witness. The way it dabbles its feet on so many concepts while staying afloat from all the cliches and coming out victorious on the other side in that style and class is a daunting task to be performed and accomplished. This title keeps on fighting where others just tap out. Its attempt to be a thriller, mystery and horror film at the same time doesn't go in vain or ends in a failure, adding layers and layers of rich culture into the familiar to transform it into the unfamiliar, which hardly gets the respect or attention that it deserved. It has been half a decade since it released, and there are only certain titles which can come close to its brilliance in the horror genre, let alone in the thriller or mystery category of films. It's a gigantic task to outperform this genre-defying and ambiguous title, and what it offers to the viewer. It's an once-in-a-lifetime sort of experience that is equal parts wonderful and horrifying to witness, as it unfolds its dark and haunting layers, which doesn't seem to end until it does, which leaves you breathless at its excellence and abandons you with a deep, vacant void that can't be filled, every attempt ending fruitless and in a disappointment. Now, in the brink of a long and treacherous journey, what does a film need after you have been slapped with the atmosphere and spanked with all those layers. A good climactic twist. After a strong start, an abundance of plot lines, and the high that comes with it, all we need is a thrilling drop that can make us feel woozy from that wild ride. The perfect meal to seal the deal. As aftertaste is what matters in almost everything we do. Of course, the previous points that I detailed are very much needed for this to function properly and be effective. But what's the point of having an amazing beginning or a layered narrative if all of it just gets squandered by the final segment? As it's what you remember vividly after the curtain closes. It isn't a must-have in every film, and not necessary by any means. Still, it is pretty much a given that a mystery or thriller film is going to have a turnabout by the third act. It begs for a surprise revelation in the climax stage to pull the rug off under the comfortable sitting spot of the viewer, maximizing the potency of that shock mechanics. And again, it's not for the sake of having a mind-bending twist to attract a certain type of audience who feed off those nonsensical, over-the-top, absolute bonkers, confusing films. There is a delicate and fine line between it being unnecessarily and hastily added on the story and a sensible turn of events that catches you by surprise, getting hit with that unexpected curveball. And to end this all, I have chosen one of the most devastating films I have ever seen. A soul-crushing story and sleepless nights-inducing title, dripping in infamy, the one and only Old Boy, a neo-noir action thriller which came out in 2003, directed by Park Chan-wook, who loosely adapted it from a Japanese manga of the same name, being part of that wicked Vengeance trilogy, which solidified the reputation of the director as being one of the best in that department, giving us handful of classics in a small period of time. There are certain titles from that and the trilogy which could have featured in here as the dominant piece, but the way Old Boy concludes is something truly noteworthy. But before we get to that part, let's get to know the brilliance of how it all begins. We are introduced to Otaisu, an obnoxious drunk who gets abducted from the street after being bailed from prison, where his captors provide food and clothes for him. Seductives being used when it gets out of control or when he tries to take his life after he has had enough of that derelict living. Being stripped away of every basic human right that we take for granted, with the TV being the only source for him to be made aware of what is happening in the world, which will keep moving on, leaving him behind in that cell to be forgotten, and a constant reminder of how less he did with the time he was given to freely roam the world. Until he is unexpectedly released. After 15 long and tormenting years, devoid of any human contact, just a journal to jot down his thoughts, keeping him somewhat sane throughout that period. The deliberate emancipation adds more questions to an already loaded person. Why was he captured? Why wasn't he killed? What did he do to deserve such punishment? Was it an unsuccessful attempt at kidnapping him? Did they spare him because they couldn't risk getting caught? Why go to such a length just to let him go freely after all those years? These and many queries is what one might be thinking of while watching the film, and are the ones which would be revolving around the mind of our potential protagonist, who goes on an extraordinary and violent journey of locating his jailer, in the quest for vengeance and getting retribution, hoping to find the answers all of us were looking for. A failed father who couldn't provide the bare minimum, being the prime suspect of his wife's murder, and overall, an individual who isn't left with much to live for, which makes him the perfect character to depict the harsh and brutal nature of getting revenge, and its blinding effect which makes for rushed and dubious judgments without caring much about the repercussions. This and the way it all starts does an honest job at building up a perfect set to establish variety of questions the viewer can ask and think of, or see being fulfilled by the time it all ends. And the film does provide that. In the most sensible manner it can. But what makes this title so astonishing is how it answers the unimaginable, the unforeseen, and the unaskable. That's the extent I am willing to go before spoiling some vital details for this film. I have been trying my best to not overspill anything about most of the titles I have used so far, even though the topic in hand is about subversion and plot twist. But with that, I can and will stop talking about what happens in this warping tale about revenge. As I hate when people say something along the lines of, "Oh, this movie's ending will get you, man. You will never see the ending coming," even though I have been doing something similar. It's the simplest way of ruining a title for a person who hasn't seen it. It makes you look for subtle changes that can lead up to something drastic to occur, ruining the overall experience. Rather than being absorbed by the story, you're on the constant lookout to catch a glimpse of the slightest hint that can determine the ending, undermining its effect, or can make it underwhelming, as you don't find it as satisfying as the ones who were caught off guard with it. You can never achieve that ungraspable moment. It dismantles the surprise mechanics and has ruined so many films for me and my friends. From moronic articles who spread that, to videos which spoils with an irreversible effect. Which is why I prefer judging films on the basis of their ratings and reading its synopsis, rather than scouring all the reviews or watching those look-alike and sound-alike trailers. It's a way better system to evaluate which titles are better and worthy of your time, rather than watching them to judge it for yourself. An inefficient and time-consuming process. And on top of that, it doesn't spoil anything about its plot. There are so many titles who have worked miraculously on me because I wasn't expecting anything astounding from it. There are countless ways or variations to exercise the plot twist mechanics in this and numerous other genres. There is the classic whodunit in murder mysteries, an old and timeless concept where you are presented with a crime that took place in the presence of a handful group of people, used to keep the viewer guessing who is the culprit, as each character with passing time are stripped away of their innocence, displaying their true motives as to how they despised the victim and could have potentially caused that to happen. The gigantic issue with that is the expectation of something bizarre must have taken place. It can't be the obvious bad guy, they can be a misunderstood and flawed individual. And your goody two-shoes character can't be a saint. For all we know, it's a false persona put on to carry that facade which is waiting to be washed off by our genius detective guy. Your typical Sherlock Holmes-esque character, which, as already established, isn't liked in my abode, for reasons already stated, which is extremely prominent in bygone and dated murder mysteries. You know, your good old, the good guy was the bad guy, and the bad guy wasn't as bad as we all thought they were. The good guy was just really convincing and manipulative, which has been reinvented in certain modern titles that works and isn't dull by any means. But for every grand and stellar Knives Out, there is the subtle ingenious of the guilty and its own way of having a plot twist. This brings in Old Boy back in the equation, and why I used it here for its subversion properties and how it deals with that formula. To me, a twist works the best when you, the viewer, aren't expecting of any twist to take place. You can't brace for something if you aren't aware of the fact that something is about to emerge. It's the same unexpected feeling, just from a different point of view. And this film does that in a fashion which I couldn't have imagined in my worst nightmare. And the first act is highly responsible for why it works in the way it does. Park Chan-wook is known for portraying extremely detailed visualization of the dampened nature of the human psyche. When it's stretched and played out to its limit, how does it react when all it can think of is getting revenge for all the pain they endured, without pondering as to why? Why will anyone do that to me? I must have done something to them that must have caused intense distress to deserve the suffering that I had to go through. And sometimes there isn't a single reasoning behind as to why they chose to do that, or the ones they had weren't warranting enough of the agony they made the other person undergo. It's a very complicated emotion to be expressed in any media, and has been used in numerous sorts of mediums as a means to carry their plot. A tough theme to demonstrate properly, and even when it is done in a somewhat coherent manner, it can leave the audience with varying and divided opinion. It isn't going to satisfy the requirements of every person. Something that the American remake failed to emulate in almost every level, releasing a decade after the original title was bestowed upon us, adding to the pile of dull Western remakes. A prime suspect of trying to mimic the body of an untamable giant, falling short at the attempt of translating the message that the original title did with such elegance. The atmosphere was just a sad sight to witness, as again they thought that a star-studded cast is going to fill in the massive gap left by that tasteless and vapid direction. The mood or feeling one expects for such a film to have was nowhere to be found. Another cash cow project being absent of a single thing of value to be offered. The inevitability of cruelty that comes with revenge was left out from the rendition. The proficient utilization of violence which was needed to be shown was dumbed down, not thrown in there to disgust or shock the audience, but has a poetic purpose to visually play out a tale about how diabolical and dastardly us humans are capable of, inciting torture to such a level where even the most obscene minds would question, was it necessary? Was it needed just to send a message? Were my reasons valid enough? Old Boy is a corrupted ride that confronts us with feelings that we don't want to face, being left with all those lingering questions we can't hide from, being reminded of those immoral visuals. It's a title that you watch once, and just once. The morbid curiosity to witness its depravity isn't for the easily disturbed, being played like a fiddle by your emotions in a similar way to our protagonist. A thrill-inducing, heart-wrenching, and deeply provoking behemoth of a title, which has left an unshakable impact on the film industry with its twists and turns. Finally, I have conquered the colossal segment of the video, and now all I have to worry about is how to conclude all of this. Well, rather than overselling it more, let's focus on the downcomings for a minute. If somehow you didn't notice it, the 3 titles that I focused on were hailing from South Korea. And if I'm being honest, I didn't even notice it while working on the script. Halfway through that whole process is when I came to that realization. It isn't a huge issue, as there are numerous films that I can or could have used there to advance my points. The reason I used those titles in the pattern I did was to prioritize their stronger points, as they can easily fulfill each other's roles. And another plus point being, They are amongst the best of that genre from that continent. Before someone points it out, I do understand that it doesn't mean every film from there is the creme de la creme. There are bountiful of Asian thriller titles that feel lacking, some that I used in this video too. It is prone to happen. None of those industries are perfect and have some not bad apples, but they aren't spotless either. Those are unavoidable, and every single point mentioned here isn't applicable to all of them. However, in the grand scheme of things, the upper echelon of theirs is pretty much invincible. Their best can't be matched by what the West has in their arsenal for use. The overall aura of natural flair that Asian thriller possess is like an immortal leviathan. No matter what you throw at it, it isn't going to do any denting damage or put a stain to its reputation. And I'm going to stop right there before I divert back to the pretentious route. The point has been made clear, adorned with scintillating phrases, and it's dangerously close to being over-infused. So, I guess this marks the end of this long, arduous journey of ours, almost shy of being an hour long. A passion project that has been eating my mind for almost 2 fucking years. Now, all that is left is the silence and feeling of emptiness its completion was bound to bring.